William F. Buckley Jr. in our little maze. And the first person in it, in the gallery, is Ronald Reagan, looking very new frontierish and aggressive. Ronald Reagan's caused a big stir in '67. The thing that's amazed me more than anything else about him is his straight talking, his, I am not a politician, I am a common man. I find this dangerous as a liberal. What do you think?
Well, in the first place, it seems to me that that garb is manifestly suitable for getting around America these days. I think that's an excellent way to dress, for instance, if you want to cross Central Park at night. I'm not trying to be completely frivolous. I think that it is true that America has moved in a certain direction, and that that is a direction that forces you to look square into the eyes of a whole series of eschatological considerations that one wouldn't have to in a mature, civilized society, such as the protection of yourself, your life,
but
your
don't you think
property,
that,
your peace.
Don't you think that Reagan is simplistic in this looking into eschatological problems?
Well, all right. Suppose we say that he is because he doesn't roll enough syllables into a speech in which he mentions the necessity for law and order. Now, surely what is manifest at this point is that we need more law and order, and we especially need it when it is not only the society's hoodlums who are defying the very idea of society, of law and order, but also its philosophers, and also some of those people who are most signally honored. When Martin Luther King says, I'm going to lead America into mutinous ways beginning next spring, then people who get back and say fundamental things about the necessity for law and order become more attractive. Now, why should you blame that on Reagan? What you should really say is that people who bring this up in an ideal situation are people who are speaking such truisms as to make them unnoticeable, but they are not unnoticeable.
Maybe we'll come back to this because a few of the other people in the maze have relevance. Here. If,
is that the Beatles?
The Beatles. Come stand here and watch. Now, for me, the Beatles are a big thing.
Yeah.
A lot of people are calling them, the gods of the changes of a whole youth culture. But apart from that, even serious writers, I read an article today on the plane coming over that said that they are in the top rank of modern composers. They've done a lot. They've explored so many fields and done so many things. Do you like them?
No, but I find this something that I fault myself for not liking them. I don't like Chopin either, for instance. I don't think that's Chopin's fault, but mine. I don't like the Beatles.
But the Beatles are so eclectic, Bill. I mean, isn't there something in them that you can find?
Sure. If I listen to an hour of Beatles, I'll find about 8 or 9 minutes that I enjoy. I do admire them, and I grant their talent. What I am not totally enthusiastic about is the effect of the Beatles, because it seems to me that those who look to the Beatles for some sort of philosophical inspiration see them always going to alien places to consult gurus and people in order to get a genuine spiritual experiences, rather than, and in the circumstances, they seem to proceed on the assumption that it can't be found in Western Christian experience.
Maybe, okay, I'll not come back, we'll go around a bit further. Here's another one, another guru of the young, Mr. Buckley. Well, Bobby Kennedy, Joseph Kennedy, or Hoover, when he was asked about Bobby Kennedy in the 60s, late 60s, said that he liked his father and he admired his brother, but that was it. Have you anything further to add to Hoover's comment?
Well, I once asked Mr. Hoover what he thought about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he said there was nothing wrong with Roosevelt that a major miracle couldn't cure.
And that's it.
Well, I think that Mr. Kennedy reads experience wrongly, and that his prescriptions for America are almost obstinately wrong-headed, which is one reason why I do not support him politically.
Okay, let's move on to the next picture. I'll surprise you with this one. This one is Shirley Temple. Now, Shirley Temple Black ran for political office and lost. And she lost significantly to a dove. An ex-Marine, all right, but a dove. Do you think this is significant? I mean, do you think it's significant? No.
Not at all.
Why not?
The reason it isn't is because even a more left-wing community, which abuts on hers, i.e. San Francisco, when asked to endorse the war or not, endorsed it in the same election. Her loss was the result of a number of very complicated factors, which I think you will find will get disentangled next season. Her intention is to run in the Republican primary when only Republicans can vote. She will almost certainly win that primary, which means that the incumbent, the man who beat her, will be out of politics for the next couple of years. Then she'll be up against a Democrat, and what happens then will largely be a reflection of what happens nationally.
Okay, we'll see. Maybe we'll come back to that later. Here's just a jumble of letters, DNA. I don't know much about DNA, but I know there's been a lot of scientific and medical progress, transplanting of hearts and so on. Now, maybe this is an obvious question, but do you yourself, as a man with traditionalist views, do you think that this kind of progress may lead us into a sort of Huxley Brave New World?
Yes, I do. Yes, I do.
Do you fear this?
I do fear it. I do fear it. It's interesting you should bring that up because not quite enough thinking has gone on based on the certitude of our mortality. Obviously, one should do everything one can to save people who are struck down prematurely. But almost inevitably, you discover an expertise which gets put to the uses of a kind of geriatrics, which is absolutely unthinking.
Wasn't penicillin
the idea,
that, Bill, really? I mean...
No, I don't think so. I don't deny that penicillin has been used sometimes to keep 98-year-old people live alive for another year, even 98-year-old people who are, let's say, completely out of their wits. So that I do think that an over-concern with the prolongation of life is a reflection of a lack of emotional maturity on many people.
Okay, that's interesting. Let's pass on to this next one. What is it? Oh, this one here. Warren Beatty, Faye Dunaway. They're young, they're in love, Bonnie and Clyde, and they kill people. Have you seen the film?
Yes, I have.
What did you think of it?
I thought it was great.
Why?
Well, largely because I think one could view it as a masterful movie. I think it was a high development of the art. I don't think that it was out there to suggest that this was a permissible form of escapism, going out and robbing banks. And I think it's both vulgar and self-conscious.
Do you think the sweeping
to suggest otherwise?
Do you think the sweeping statement that some critics have made that it's one of the few films that have really shown what the true American depth is? You know, the violence, the depths of the violent depths of the American character. Or do you think that's going too far?
I think it's going too far. I think it's true that America tends to be a violent country, but I think the fact of the continuous government in America, what is it? Ours is the third oldest government in the world, something like that. Under the circumstances, is a high tribute to our capacity, our political capacity and our moral capacity to organize a society in which people often feel violently impelled to pursue their own gods. The fact is that they were struck down by bullets, and the fact is, as a matter of fact, which is not widely known, that there are fewer murders today even than there were 20 or 30 years ago. This doesn't deny what I said a moment ago. There is a crisis of law and order, but it doesn't tend to be a crisis of homicide.
Don't you think in the mind of Penn, who directed it, and Beatty, who produced it, there was a kind of symbology or reference to the Vietnam War and the kind of hysteria or violent hysteria that the Vietnam War might bring about in the American nation?
No. I think that people with active...
It's a good question.
I think people with active imaginations like yours have difficulty with political Rorschach tests, and that you can see this and translate it into American aggressiveness in North Vietnam, whereas other people would look at it and see the story of Bonnie and Clyde.
Yes, but...
I think that your imagination is fertile and very valuable, but I don't think that it has succeeded in intuiting and in a meaning to Bonnie and Clyde, which
my line, more than saying as a direct reference to Vietnam, my position would be simply that the picture points up blaseness and, if you like, hardness towards violence, inflicted upon us by the constant daily news bulletins of Vietnam, the number of television shows that are violent. This film started off in a very flip, typical Hollywood way and then moved into some horrific and terrifying violence. And I think that's, to my mind, that's what it was trying to do.
Well, but the fact that you say it was terrifying is, to me, the key observation. As long as it terrified you and it terrified me and it terrified the typical viewer, then one must consider it morally salubrious. I happen to feel about the Vietnam War that it is an exercise in the highest kind of idealism. That is to say, the American people who are prepared to undertake those sacrifices in behalf of essentially other situations.
Stay a moment.
Yeah.
We'll move over that. To my left, I don't have to introduce Stokely Carmichael in his hat. What do you think we should do with Stokely Carmichael, or should be done with Stokely Carmichael?
I think he should be put in jail.
In Britain, Michael X, his equivalent, his black Muslim equivalent, has been put in jail. Yeah. Why should he be put in jail?
Well, because he is a clear and present danger. As you know, under the American Constitution is defined, the requirements of law and order take precedence over certain kinds of individual freedom. You can't shout fire in a crowded movie theater. It was a famous qualification of Oliver Wendell Holmes. Now, we know, for instance, that Rap Brown gave a speech in Cambridge, Maryland, and within 12 hours, Cambridge, Maryland practically didn't exist. It was burned to the ground. So there is a very concrete case to suggest that the kind of oratory that Rap Brown and Stokely Carmichael engage in endangers the lives of innocent people, and that under the circumstances, until they learn to confine themselves to the very broad limits of the freedom of speech, they belong in jail.
Bill,
where they can't be heard.
You're a man who doesn't like to be categorized, and you know, I wouldn't suggest that your view was a blanket one, immediately of black power or whatever, but that perhaps...
I believe in black power, by the way.
What I was going to say is, can you understand this whole...
Oh, sure, sure. I think
is there a part of you that understands it?
Yes. I think that black power, understood as the organization of the Negro community in order to press for justice and press for opportunity, is most desirable. And you find people like Patrick Moynihan, who consider Carmichael a dangerous wild dog, nevertheless believing that one of the principal derelictions of the Negro community is their failure to take power and to assert themselves, both economically and politically.
Yeah. Here's a picture. We have a picture of a riot. This is done by a group of people in Boston, displayed at a church here. What do you think? I mean, do you think riots are any answer at all?
I think it's a typical example of proletarian art. It's the kind of thing that Orozco was doing in Mexico 25, 30 years ago. And I think that it suggests the people who are obviously right and the people who are obviously wrong.
Yes, Bill, but when you say proletarian art, you know, that is an aesthetic distance which we can afford to take. And I can't help thinking that, you know, must patronize. But what we mustn't look at that and say that's proletarian art. We must say, why? You know, I mean...
Well, because there's a lot of emotional simple-mindedness by idealistic people who, in a riot situation, automatically assume that the rioters are correct and the policemen incorrect. It's the kind of thing that you see even with great, big, sophisticated people like John Kenneth Galbraith, who teaches at Harvard University, saying when he automatically refuses to cross a picket line. Now, this is without even inquiry to find out what are the bases of dispute. Now, this kind of, as I say, childishness produces that kind of, quotes, art. It isn't art, of course. It's simply polemics in the form of art. And, of course, it traduces art.
In our incoherent ramble, here's a miniskirt from London. It has a picture of Bob Dylan on the front. Let me divide this up. It's a very serious point. Do you like miniskirts for a start? Would you let your wife wear a miniskirt?
Well, she does. She does, about that length.
I'll tell you, in London, where I've just come back from, they're wearing them there, you know. And it's funny because Mary Quant said in London when I was there that there's only one erogenous zone left, and that's a crotch. And do you think this is bad, or do you think it's just natural, you know, that we should go on this way?
Well, there's a whole business of the shifting of the erogenous zone. It's a psychological truism that which is veiled is attractive, and under the circumstances, there would be nothing erotic at all in any area of the human body if it were subject to relentless exposure. And a highly abbreviated miniskirt is, after all, simply another form of a bathing suit. Now, a bathing suit is not intrinsically wrong, morally or rightly. It's simply an aesthetic proposition.
Yeah.
I simply think it's disturbing to find women with skirts so short that they have to face it as an acrobatic problem, how to sit down without an unwanted exposure.
That's true. That's true. Yeah. Here's somebody, two people who, perhaps acrobats in a different way. Dynamic duo, but not Robin and Batman. Johnson and Humphrey. Do you think that they... Well, let me put this first this way. Do you think that after having said that he was going to create a great society, do you think he has done?
No, of course not.
Why? Why not?
Well, in the first place...
This has to be brief, but...
Sure. Well, his appetite was too large. That is to say, a great society is something that you can create for yourself and I can create for myself, studying our teachers and our spiritual lords and so on, but it has nothing whatever to do with power politics coming out of Washington, D.C. So it was a terrible act of political hubris that he should even have conceived of the notion of his administering a great society.
I'd like to come back on
to
this
say nothing of his manifest personal
when we sit down.
Yeah.
Here's some draft cards being burned. A very quick answer. What would you do? General Hershey says he'd like to classify them 1A, and there's been a lot of uproar about this, and I personally resent that statement, but what would you do to these people who burn draft cards?
Well, I would administer the law.
Which is?
The law says that it is illegal to burn a draft card. Now, you may or may not be aware that a lot of people who burn their draft cards end up having burnt facsimiles of them, so that they become terribly heroic in front of the camera, but when they appear before a grand jury, they sort of wink and pull out the virginal draft card and show that it is still intact.
Is there any part of you that says this is a courageous act?
It's only courageous if the consequences are sure. I admire the person who burns his draft card and then repairs to jail and suffers the indignity of a tenure in jail. But I don't admire at all people who trade on heroism without, in fact, facing the consequences of it. And this, I think, is what mostly goes on. There have only been, incidentally, these are figures 48 hours old, 360 detectably burnt draft cards in spite of the Holocaust that we are supposed to have seen in burnt draft cards. Well, it's usually old driver's licenses.
Now, move on to an old friend of yours. You ran in the mail-through race against John Lindsay for mayor of New York, and I've read several things you said about him, one of which is that as a Republican, he doesn't make it. Why do you object to him as a Republican?
Well, because he isn't. I would object to a chicken if he called himself a peacock and vice versa. It seems to me that political terminology in non-chaotic situations has got to be communicable. The fact of the matter was that the hard left in New York City voted for Lindsay. Now, they won't deny this. In fact, much of his campaign literature proclaimed him as the most liberal of all the candidates who were running, and the campaign literature was correct. But if it is correct, then surely you would agree it's paradoxical in a two-party system to have him pose as a Republican. He's a Republican only by baptismal affirmation, not as a result of any of his conduct.
He's a very good television personality. Do you think that says something about modern politics? Reagan, Robert Vaughn, who's following the Democrats for dissent?
Yeah, sure. I think it helps to be successful in the dominating medium, and he certainly is in television.
Here we've been confronted with a torn symbol here. It's torn. It's a pound, and maybe it should be torn. As I say, I've just come back from England, and I must admit that the most people I saw didn't seem to give a tuppenny damn about whether the pound had been devalued or not, and went on drinking their pints and having a good time. And Christmas shopping was up to a peak. Two questions I'd like to ask. First, do you think people really care about governmental decisions of this nature and this magnitude?
Well, I think they care when the consequences of bad government are manifest. For instance, I think that inevitably the English are going to care when there is an inflation, when it becomes obvious to them that their pounds purchase less than they used to pay. Mm-hmm. Now, then, of course, what they will do is rush for salary increases and so on in order to make up. And when they find out that this is impossible, then I think they will care deeply. A lot of people tend to think of economics as that, an abstract, dismal science, which X number of people worry about over there, but which has absolutely no relevance at all to your life and mine. But I guess more and more people are going to learn different.
Okay, the second thing I'd like to ask you on that is, just yesterday, or recently, at any rate, Johnson has made it plain that America's balance of payments is none too good. This obviously is a very difficult question for you to answer, but as briefly as you can. Do you think if a country, now this is just a very simplistic thing I'm going to say, but from my experience in England and America, if a country is not going to be a communist country, it's going to be a capitalist country, do you think it should be as laissez-faire as possible? In other words, do you think it works better if it's as laissez-faire as possible?
I do.
Why do you think that? Because I really don't know why.
Well, the reason why is because the marketplace makes adjudications in behalf of the individual much more shrewdly than a single intelligence can. I don't know, for instance, whether you prefer rye bread or white bread, but I know that under the marketplace system, your preference is going to be recorded in an IBM machine that is much too complex for man ever to create. And under the circumstances, to the extent that I think that your own wishes ought to be respected, then the free marketplace is your, in my judgment, best protector.
My one comeback on that would be, and I'm almost quoting from one of your articles, is that you say that government shouldn't have a big hand in spending an organization, that the individual can do it. But how can the individual do it in such a vast society? Mustn't government really take a big hand? I mean, another thing you said was that the big sort of hatred in socialists, the thing they really dislike, is that one man is making more money than the next. And the reason I would go along with this, if any, is because that per se is not so bad. But we still must use words like exploitation. That if one man is making a lot of money and a lot of men are making a little money working their guts out for him, that still strikes me as wrong. And that's capitalism.
Well, but why is it wrong if there are alternatives? In a monopoly situation where there are no alternatives, then I agree with you, it's wrong. If we are only privileged to buy a Chevrolet, then we are being exploited by General Motors. But if we have alternatives, then we're not being exploited.
I must say that, a nationalized industry doesn't need necessarily only have to make one car. He may make 10, and he may make them all well. Moshe Dayan led the Israelis to an incredible victory and divided the world as well. He also pushed America probably further from, even taking into account the Glassboro Conference. He pushed the two powers at extremes again. For a start, do you think that it's a good sign that people in America are admiring Dayan for his great military victory?
Sure. I think it's an extremely good sign. I think what it is a tremendous tribute to an act of national will. Israel wouldn't exist today except for the fact that it willed its own existence and was prepared to harness all of its resources to that end, both domestically and internationally. Now, Americans, I think, quite naturally admire countries which, against those odds, nevertheless prevail. And for that reason, I think he
Yes, but I at the expense of sounding sort of cliche, his chauvinism bothers me because it seems to be a natural come out of military victory. Anyway, we must go on to Timothy Leary.
Now, wait a minute. You've developed a very, very, very interesting habit.
Can't I bring Timothy Leary into it? Because there he stands.
But I don't think it is chauvinistic. I think Dayan has said, I insist on what I have conquered simply because from it I am in a position to protect Israel. Now, I think that if the surrounding hostile territories were to withdraw their claims to the illegitimacy of Israel, then we would have a case against Dayan. We have no reason to suppose that he would press against the case for withdrawal to the old boundaries. Go ahead.
Okay, this is, as you know, Timothy Leary, an ex-Harvard professor and the big high priest of the LSD, but he recently got married and said he's not on drugs anymore. For a start, what did you ever think of Timothy Leary? You talked to him on firing line, right?
Yes, yeah, and a couple other times. It's a perfectly orthodox case of escapism, mutatis mutandis. I mean, this is the equivalent of a whiskey in another age, or...
Oh, but Bill, isn't taking of an LSD trip when one wanders into the realms of frightening cellular history, can you really call that escapism?
Well, I think he finds it, at least to say, if we are to accept his own version of what happens to him under LSD, he doesn't find it horrifying at all. He finds it immensely liberating. He finds it, quotes, mind expanding.
So Blake found his engravings liberating.
What?
Blake found his engravings and his great poems liberating, and they were horrifying and torturous and agonizing for him too. And can we just dismiss it as escapism?
Well, if you accept the proposition that anything an individual does and finds relief in must be sanctioned, then you take the position that if he decides to take heroin and ultimately die from the use of it, Nevertheless, this also is understandable. Now, it seems to me that there is a clear case of diminished intellectual vitality in this man here, and one must assume in the absence of other evidence.
I would agree there's a case of diminished intellectual vitality, possibly because intellectual vitality is not his idea of a supreme vitality. I mean, I'm not so much arguing against for Leary. What I'm saying is that we must, I think, sort of think, re-look at our terms.
Look,
the intellectual...
Yeah, you're posing Camus' question. Well, you said the only serious philosophical question for anybody in the world today is whether or not to commit suicide. And it's quite true. Somebody might say, well, the ultimate form of escapism is the escapism of Ernest Hemingway. But there are those others who believe that one has to come to terms with the world, better it in its own terms, which means without recourse to drugs, which completely alter the structure of reality.
Okay, well, now, here's what most people call a tasteless poster, Vacation in Vietnam, a tropical paradise. There's a whole million things I can ask you about Vietnam, but the thing that I'm more interested in than anything else, as an acute social commentator, do you think this country is becoming very cynical, and if not cynical, very tired of the Vietnam War?
Oh, terribly tired, yes, because it isn't a part of the American tempo to do things slowly. We are extremely tired of the Vietnam War, and especially tired because we don't completely understand. I don't, for instance, I don't think a lot of other people do, why it has to be paced andante. And therefore I say we are tired, but we seem not to be tired, or not to be unbelieving about the essential strategic calculations that caused us to go to Vietnam and stick it out.
Yes, but you say that you can't understand the pussyfooting, the slowness, and so on. But isn't this just a sign of the wrongness of the thing? Mainly because, okay, a war is being fought, America can support a war, and so on. But for the first time, or maybe you're going to really jump on me for this, but I'm suggesting for the first time, there's a kind of collective consciousness that perhaps the war is no answer. Now, maybe this is due to the fact that the last war was so horrific, and so world-grabbing, and it was a Holocaust. We've had our Holocaust. And maybe, maybe this is why people are tired of Vietnam. Not so much that they want to win, but because they don't like killing people anymore, perhaps.
Well, I don't think anybody ever liked killing people, at least nobody I ever met. I don't, however, know anybody whom I would give any... No, I don't think they liked killing people in the Crusades. I think the Nazis liked killing the Jews. But I can't think of any war in which we have ever participated, in which people enjoyed killing. I suppose there are individual sadists, as there are in every situation. But I don't think we like killing people at all. But we renounce what I consider to be the creeping heresy of pacifism, namely that nothing is worth as much as is needed to protect it by force. This, I think, the American people continue to renounce. And I would predict that nobody in 1968 will make any headway at all on a purely pacifist ticket.
Well, I agree with that, but I'm not sure I agree with what you said before. Allen Ginsberg, one of the 50s, at any rate, leading poets, beat poet, protester. Pot is fun, is it?
I don't know. I don't know. I assume it must be.
Do you think people should be allowed
in the free marketplace, it wouldn't sell for $10 a joint or whatever you call it.
Bill, do you really think that people should be put in jail for 10 years for smoking a marijuana joint?
No, I don't. No, I don't. As a matter of fact, I can't think of anybody who has been. Can you? So what
but
are you talking about?
even the intent is pretty horrific. I mean, a poor 18-year-old.
Well, there are a lot of laws on the books. For instance, you can get hanged in Connecticut for sodomy. But I think we'd waste our time discussing whether or not we believed in that law.
But I don't think this is as extreme as those kind of blue laws.
It is, because I don't know anybody who's gone to jail for 10 years for smoking pot.
Maybe they're all being herded now, and they're all just about to go.
Well, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. It's not going to happen. The point is that there are a lot of scientifically unanswered questions about pot, and a certain number of culturally unanswered questions about pot. Pot's isn't our vice yet, There's a certain thing to be said for a culture identifying its own vices and sticking to them. I know you understand what I mean, and I know we don't have time to elaborate.
Well, while we're still with the snowy figure of Ginsberg, contemporary literature is somewhat obsessed with, I mean, even from the almost banal level of the Valley of the Dolls right through to, I'd say, the great level, the great Swiftian level of William Burroughs. We seem to be obsessed with this business of playing with our bodies, with pushing it to an extreme, We're seeing what we can do with ourselves, but sexually and physiologically. Why is this? And is this good literature, Bill? Or is it a bad literature? I want to know your opinion.
Well, I think it's a vital literature, and I think that it does suggest the kind of despair that automatically happens when people lose their spiritual roots. It is a search for sensation as a substitute, as a sort of a narcotic substitute for philosophy, the kind of thing that sufficed with Socrates, who was actually able to go into a trance into which he was not induced by a liquor or by drugs or by sex, but something he was introduced simply by reflection, is something that we tend to be missing nowadays, isn't it?
Yes, but Coleridge was induced into
romantic
vision and ecstasy by a drug too.
Oh, sure. Sure, and so was Poe, and so are a great many jazz musicians and so on and so forth. But these are temporary stimulants, but this is not a temporary stimulant. This is a way of life. This is Marquis de Sade toward sex. That is to say, this is an analog of a complete perversion of the whole idea of a stimulant.
How different can we get? Eisenhower and Tricky Dicky call him here, ex-Vice President Nixon. Do you think Nixon could be the Republican nominee in 1968?
Yes, I do.
Would you be pleased?
Yes, I'd be quite pleased. Mm-hmm.
Why?
Because I like him, and because I think he would make a good president, and because I think that he has moorings. I think he knows a great deal about America, and that he is committed to the well-being of America.
Does he know a great deal about the rest of the world?
I think probably more than any president we've had in this century.
Is that saying a lot?
It's saying a fair amount. It's saying a fair amount. The nearest thing to it, I think, would be Hoover. You know, it is widely supposed that Wilson knew a lot about the rest of the world. He didn't, not a word. He didn't know a single foreign language. He hadn't ever traveled across the Atlantic. Roosevelt was, of course, a dilettante. But I think Nixon is the kind of person who, without any difficulty at all, could stand right here and lecture for 10 weeks, God save us, on the internal politics and the history and the culture of different countries in the world. He is greatly sold short intellectually, incidentally.
Are those people who say he's a I was just going to say,
yeah.
Are those people who say he's a Philistine greatly misjudging the man?
No, but it's mostly an act of sort of self-masturbation. These intellectuals who don't like him because he doesn't speak with a Harvard accent, can't tell you enough about Middletown in transition and all those little myths that bind this community so often phony together. He simply didn't have an Ivy League education, and for that reason, people get sort of sniffy about him. They wouldn't get sniffy about him if he was on the left. Then they would find him charming, the way they found Harry Truman charming.
Bill,
but it's a phony. The depreciation of Nixon, as I say, is not something which, in my judgment, does any credit, moral or intellectual, to his detractors.
Bill, I was going to say this is the first time I met you, but your accent is not his accent, and yet you support those who, Goldwater, Reagan, the extreme right wingers, the unintellectuals. It surprises me.
Now, wait a minute.
Well, I would call Reagan I wouldn't call Reagan an intellectual, except perhaps defining it in the term that he thinks. But I don't think he thinks subtly or in a complex way. And yet...
I think, well, as a matter of fact, I think he does. But anyway, go ahead. Go ahead. I think you're using superficial categories.
Well,
go ahead.
It's difficult to but if I can go on by saying, I find it difficult for a man who writes in such a complex style, complex syllogisms and past references and so on, a man who pays a great debt to complexity as you do, and to the complexity of motivation, political motivation. I find it difficult for you to support Reagan and Goldwater in such a wholehearted way as you did. Had you no reservations about Barry Goldwater's ability to distinguish between subtle differences?
No, I think that you're begging the important question. The important question is, what are the resolutions? For instance, if you were very stupid, but nevertheless you believed in the right of white people or Negro people or Jewish people to exist, I would say that it's much more important that you concede this right than that you should concede that right, not concede that right and be bright. you see.
Okay, I'm
now,
not saying that we
the
should...
process of governing now is so complex that it can't be done successfully by anybody.
Okay.
That is to say, the number of bills that are passed every year that a president has to administer simply would overawe Erasmus. He just simply couldn't do it.
But then I've got to say that
what matters is where do they come out?
But I've got to say that then you're one of McLuhan's real children, because then you're saying Reagan and Goldwater, they're not complex, and nobody, however complex, can rule. But then their image is good enough. They can do it because at least they talk the right language.
I'm not saying anything of the sort.
Oh, right.
I'm not saying anything of the sort. And I just finished saying that I consider Nixon to be a very bright man. Let me add that I consider Reagan to be an extremely bright man. I don't doubt for a minute that Reagan could have been a full professor of whatever at Harvard University if such had been his training. What I care very much about is the values and the hierarchy of values that they have wrenched out of existence. And for you to suggest that unless you wrench that existence without first having mastered Leibniz is A, snobbish, and B, historically untrue. Some of the greatest rulers in the history of the world have not been pedants.
Well, it's not so much, let's move on to the flag, but it's not so much a matter of mastering Leibniz. It's perhaps, if confronted with him, knowing at least what he's trying to say. Anyway, forgive me. There's the American flag. Do you think, I'm asking this as an Englishman, obviously as an outsider, do you think that the spirit of Uncle Sam, whatever, is fading, that America really doesn't believe in itself as much as it used to?
Yes, I think that's true.
Are you sad about this?
I am very sad.
Of course you are. Why?
Why am I sad? Or why do I believe it?
Both.
Well, I'm sad because I think that the ideals of America are as fine as the ideals of any republic in the history of the world. I think it's happening in part because of a restlessness that traces to the excesses of rationalism, to the excesses of liberalism. For so long as liberalism suggested that it could bring happiness to the individual, then people tended to look to government agencies for those narcotic substitutes for a search for happiness and contentment, which they ought to have found in their religion, in their institutions, in their culture, in themselves. And this, I think, is why America ceases to be as idealistically magnetic as it has been in the past.
But what, if I may comment, without categorizing you too much, relatively at any rate, you are a traditionalist. You believe in the original traditions of the American way of life and so on. But surely the American way of life is an anti-traditional way of life. It's a rebellious way of life. It's a liberal way of life. As far as I can see, the whole reason that America started, if I may be so bland, is to get away from traditions, to get away from irrational traditions. And sometimes I sense that you, in swerving away from what you would call liberal confusion, diffusion of ideas, chaos, the going to the apocalyptic brink, this kind of thing, sometimes I feel that the traditions mean too much to you.
Well, maybe they do. Maybe they do mean too much to me. I don't know. I like some traditions, and I don't like other traditions, and I have nothing but my reason to use in discriminating between the two. Now, of course, when you talk about America being born in liberalism, I quite agree. But, of course, liberalism meant something very different in those days. I mean, can you imagine the people who framed the 9th and 10th Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, assigning to Washington, D.C. the right to prescribe juvenile delinquency programs for Boston, Massachusetts? The answer is that there has been that hubris in government, against which all those people incidentally warned us, as you are no doubt aware. But the genesis of this country was certainly anti-traditional in the sense of defying those traditions that immobilized people, that made them forever a subject class, as people were even in England, which was probably the most mobile society in that part of the 18th century. But what we have now in the United States is, it seems to me, much closer to the kind of to the kind of thing against which the founders of this country rebelled than anything that the conservatives have to offer. It is overweening government, the kind of traditionalism that can be opposed by somebody who has a vision of a great society for you or for me. is best knocked down by Professor Michael Oakeshott of the London School of Economics, who says that the trouble with overweening government is that it fuses passion and politics, and that as such creates not only frustration but also tyranny.
Right like that?
Yeah, that's fine. This is our floor manager, Jim Warren, Mr. Gordon. He will be giving you the cue to begin the conversation and then to just make sure if there's any problems he can relay it. I'll be in the control room and this will be the procedure.
Fine,
Okay?
thank you.
So we're about ready to begin?
All right.
No. No clock room? Any time cues or anything? No time cues. Right. Good. Close the doors.
As a Democratic candidate for President of the All set?
No, there's a scratch on the tape.
Oh.
Move up a little bit. Get some good stuff.
As a Democratic candidate for the office of President of the United States, I make these solemn pledges. I will end the Vietnam War in 72 hours, and upon being elected, I will immediately, without any hesitation, employing the proper safeguards, withdraw the American Army from the shores of Vietnam. I will eliminate the draft. America will export $30 billion in foreign aid yearly without any cost to the American taxpayer, and the profit from this program will pay off the national debt in 10 years. I will resolve the racial problem to the satisfaction of all America. I will eliminate legal prostitution in the federal courts. All lawyers' conduct, ethics, and fees will be rigidly controlled. I will absolutely and without question eliminate organized crime in 30 days. I will eliminate political prostitution in Congress. Retired American couples will receive $300 minimum monthly pensions without any cost to the American taxpayer. Federal taxes will be cut in half by eliminating fraudulent tax benefits for the chosen few. I will eliminate inflation and reorganize the entire banking system. I will arrest and bring to trial all conspirators now in high government position who participated in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. I will restore the Constitution and the free enterprise system to the people of the United States. I will organize a 3-year food reserve so that this nation could absolutely survive any atomic war. I will completely reorganize and re-equip and retrain the ground forces of the American Army, making them 1,000% more efficient, so that anotherable miserable showing, as has been shown in Vietnam, will never happen again to an American army. I will eliminate communist infiltration in our government and in the rocket program, and every American family under my program will be well-fed, well-clothed, and well-housed.
With riots, sit-ins, march-ins, lie-downs, screw-downs, etc. Sit-ups? Would you believe sit-ups? Would you believe lie-ins? And some of the people on the right are Patrick J. Frawley Jr., head of Schick, Eversharp, and Technicolor Enterprises. Can I?
Willie, do you know what those are?
Hey. The left grabbed headlines last year with riots, sit-ins, marches, sit-ups and sit-downs, and lie-ins. There are some names on the right that you might be interested in. One of them, Patrick J. Frawley Jr., head of Schick, Eversharp, and Technicolor Enterprises. Frawley emerged as a single biggest contributor to conservative causes in this country. George Lincoln Rockwell, self-styled Fuhrer of the American Nazi Party, assassinated. Chairman L. Mendel Rivers of the House Armed Services Committee, who defended the Birchers when they were first attacked, appeared on the forum of Clarence Mannion, Birch Council member. Alan Zoll, one of the old-time U.S. bigots, was back in action, this time at Liberty Lobby in Washington, D.C. Old-time movie actor Walter Brennan appeared on a Birch Society radio show attacking the war on poverty. The biggest relatively new name during 1967 was Reverend Daniel Lyons, a Catholic priest on leave from Gonzaga, and guess who gave him the money to get started? Patrick J. Frawley Jr. And don't believe everything you read about what happened in 1967. Several national stories indicated the Birch Society was falling apart. It's not. Number one, last summer's New England rally for family and country was a success. Number two, the Birch Society stepped up its drive to win in Vietnam or get out. Mass petitions got 675,000 names to congressmen in Washington. Third, the Birch Society set up fronts like TACT, Truth About Civil Turmoil, which have been very successful. TACT declares that the civil rights movement is communistic and is sponsoring a big campaign to support your local police. The Birch's most recent campaign is against the war on poverty. Little-known facts about the right. Moral Rearmament acquired the decommissioned Fort Slocum property from the city of New Rochelle, New York. And Protestant ministers on the right did pretty well last year also. Reverend Billy James Hargis dedicated a new $500,000 cathedral headquarters of his Christian crusade in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Then he announced the purchase of the adjoining land, price $155,000. Reverend Hargis is world-winding it around the country, will be in Boston January 29 at a 7:30 p.m. supper at the Statler Hilton, if you'd like to go. Reverend C.W. Burpo, who ran afoul of zoning law in his Bible Institute in Mesa, Arizona, announced he would build a new structure, appealed for $40,000. If the past is any indication, he'll get it. Reverend Carl McIntyre purchased another hotel for $500,000 at his Cape May, New Jersey real estate complex. McIntyre heads the 20th Century Reformation Hour and Christian Beacon programs. And positively the latest in the radical right groups or any other was an organization founded by William Buckley Jr., the intent of Buckley's group, to horsewhip Drew Pearson.
Woman of the Year. I want to nominate for Woman of the Year Eartha Kitt and for Man of the Year Dr. Benjamin Spock, because both refuse to play the game. The game is be courteous, law-abiding, obedient, never raise your voice, even in the midst of hypocrisy. The game is be willing to die or send your sons to die whenever the #1 leader of the nation says so and whether the cause is just or unjust. Eartha Kitt refused to play. She spoke her mind. She said the government is snatching young men from their families to fight in a war that no one has been able to explain or justify. And indeed, how can we justify giant, powerful America bombarding every day the peasants of a small Asian country to force them to accept a corrupt and cruel government which they themselves are unwilling to fight for? When Eartha Kitt spoke out, Lady Bird Johnson was crying a little. I think it was good that she was moved. Perhaps she will move LBJ. She is a charming and gracious woman who loves beauty, but I think she's been sheltered from the ugliness that emanates from the White House. And LBJ, he loves his children and his grandchildren, but I wonder how much he loves the children and grandchildren of Vietnam. The other day I saw on film a little North Vietnamese boy who was lying, whimpering, crying, while doctors removed from his body, one by one, the pellets from an anti-personnel bomb that had been dropped by American planes. And every day we drop such bombs on North and South Vietnam, bombs designed not for steel bridges, but for human flesh. How can we justify this? Only by lying to ourselves, or by having our leaders lie to us. And they have. LBJ lied to us July 13th, 1965, when he said he hadn't any indication the other side was willing to negotiate, when he knew of 3 distinct offers, one in the summer of '64, one in the fall of '64, one in the beginning of 1965. He's lied to us about the recent elections in South Vietnam, which were rigged with American connivance to make sure that the military men won and that anti-war candidates would not win. And this has gone on. As a result of this, today all over the world, people are looking at us with shame and with horror. They see our action as not basically different from the Hungarian action and from the Russian action in suppressing the Hungarian Revolution. Because the Vietnamese are having a revolution and we are suppressing it. And the Russians gave the excuses too. They said, well, they were fighting another system. They said they were fighting for their national security. Fanaticism enters into this. We become fanatic about the word communism. And this is part of the game. It's the game that nations have played all through history, of people killing one another every 10 or 20 years because the men in power tell us that the Catholics or the Huns or the Jews or the communists are about to take over the world. And I think the game will go on, and our children and our grandchildren will suffer from it unless we do like Eartha Kitt and break through the hypocritical silence, until we do like Dr. Spock and say it is right to refuse to fight in an unjust war. I don't want to play that game. Our country was founded on a basic democratic principle which is far more sacred than the Selective Service Act or the Book of Table Manners. The principle that many of us have forgotten but that Jefferson put into the Declaration of Independence. And this is that government and laws are not sacred, that they are set up for certain ends, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, that when they destroy these ends, we have a right to disobey. And so I will say to everyone who can hear me, if your conscience tells you that it is wrong to cross the sea to make war on the people of Vietnam, and if you refuse to fight in this war, I support you, I admire you, as I admire Miss Eartha Kitt, as I admire Dr. Benjamin Spock, and all those other people who refuse to play the game of silence in the midst of murder.